Section 1 of the 13th Amendment of the Constitution states, "Neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as a punishment for crime, whereof the party shall have been duly convicted, shall exist within the United States or any place subject to their jurisdiction." While claiming to abolish slavery, this amendment only furthered it under the guise of the prison system. As someone who is a passionate advocate for systemic change, I have been constantly educating myself on the topic for years, and I have learned things that are disheartening and disturbing. Simply put, incarcerated persons have no constitutional rights while in prison. They can be forced to work for little to no payment as punishment for their crimes. This amendment allowed for prisons to use incarcerated individuals who are disproportionately Black to be used for free labor. This has had long-lasting effects on the U.S., especially in Black communities. The clause in the amendment that states that slavery is abolished except as punishment for a crime whereof the party shall have been duly convicted left open a loophole, allowing the practice of what is called convict leasing to expand, particularly in the South. Convict leasing was a practice where incarcerated individuals were provided to private parties such as plantations or corporations such as U.S. Steel for lease. The leasee would pay the prison and be responsible for feeding, clothing, and housing the prisoners. These prisoners were paid nothing. In fact, in 1871, the Virginia Supreme Court issued a ruling that declared as a convicted person was a slave of the state. The danger of this loophole was actually recognized at the time it was created, as recounted by Dennis Childs in his book, Slaves of the State, Black Incarceration from the Chain Gang to the Penitentiary. Then Massachusetts Senator Charles Sumner argued that the version of the 13th Amendment presented to Congress in 1865 was a loophole to reestablish slavery by another name. He wanted the amendment to include the phrase, "all persons are equal before the law." He was unsuccessful, and that loophole created today's carceral state. According to the U.S. Bureau of Justice Statistics, we now incarcerate nearly 2.2 million people, with the largest prison population in the world. While the practice of convict leasing ended in the 1930s, jurisdictions across the U.S. continue to extract labor from these millions of incarcerated persons without paying them a minimum wage. With few exceptions, inmates are required to work if cleared by medical professionals. Punishments for refusing to do so include solitary confinement, loss of earned good time, and loss of family visitation. For this forced labor, prisoners earn pennies per hour, if anything at all. Incarcerated persons, or more specifically, the duly convicted, lack a constitutional right to be free of forced servitude. Further, this forced labor is not checked by many of the protections enjoyed by workers laboring in the exact same jobs on the other side of the 20-foot barbed wire electric fence, such as the case of Parker versus State Use Industries, stating that the relationship between the prison or jail and the inmate worker is not primarily economic, and so the worker is not protected under the Fair Labor Standards Act or the National Labor Relations Act. By doing this, the courts have placed wage and working condition protections out of reach for incarcerated workers. The penal labor exemption creates a demand for more prisoners and their cheap or free labor who are disproportionately Black. It is no accident that this loophole has been used today as a means of shortchanging the rights of Black Americans through incarceration. In a 2007 article in the UC Davis Law Review, William Chip Carter, professor of law at the University of Pittsburgh and one of the foremost experts on the 13th Amendment, underlined this point. Because the institution of slavery was about the incarceration of race, power, and group status, 13th Amendment should be expressly construed in terms of race, power, and group status. According to the NAACP, Black and white Americans use and sell drugs at basically the same rates. Yet the imprisonment rate of Black Americans for drug charges is almost 6 times that of whites. Black youth are portrayed as super predators, the purveyors of violence and traffickers of drugs. Surveillance and police presence are thus focused on communities of color, while their claim to social resources continues to diminish, in large part because law enforcement and penal measures increasingly devour these resources. The prison industrial complex has created a vicious cycle of punishment, which only further impoverishes those whose impoverishment is supposedly solved by imprisonment. In each generation, new tactics have been used for achieving the same goals which were shared by the Founding Fathers. Denying Black people's citizenship was deemed essential to the formation of the original Union. Hundreds of years later, America is still not an egalitarian society. In Michelle Alexander's book, The New Jim Crow, she states, quote, "Today it is perfectly legal to discriminate against criminals in nearly all the ways that it was once legal to discriminate against African Americans. Once you're labeled a felon, the old forms of discrimination, employment discrimination, housing discrimination, denial of the right to vote, denial of educational opportunity, denial of food stamps and other public benefits, and exclusion from jury service are suddenly legal. As a criminal, you have scarcely more rights and arguably less respect than a Black man living in Alabama at the height of Jim Crow. We have not ended racial caste in America. We have merely redesigned it." End quote. There are also collateral damages to the families of those imprisoned, both while they are locked up and when they are released. When men and women return from prison, their family life has an even higher likelihood of having been disrupted. And their competitiveness on the job market is even more diminished than it was before they were incarcerated. Time in prison means that these already marginal people are more marginalized, and they tend to return to living in neighborhoods that are already distressed by the presence of too many disrupted families and high levels of joblessness. These patterns likely have a vicious intergenerational cycle. Children of individuals who have been imprisoned have reduced educational opportunities, which makes it almost impossible for them to have the same employment opportunities of more privileged individuals. This means that in places of high levels of incarceration, this practice is contributing to another generation that has a heightened likelihood of living in disadvantaged communities. The current prison system is in no doubt a product of the United States' systemically racist past, and it is all made perfectly legal under the 13th Amendment to the Constitution. If you look at this photo, it is one of modern slavery. It is one of a justice system riddled with racial discrimination, of private business taking advantage of these disenfranchised people, descendants of generations of disenfranchised people before them, condemned to labor for pennies in perpetuity so that others may profit. I'll leave you with this quote from Bryan Stevenson, an American lawyer, social justice activist, founder and executive director of the Equal Justice Initiative. "People say all the time, well, I don't understand that people could have tolerated slavery. How could they have made peace with that? How could people have gone to a lynching and participated in that? That's so crazy. If I was living in that time, I would never have tolerated anything like that. And the truth is, we are living in this time, and we are tolerating